Good evening. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. This evening, we will have our second budget committee orientation. Dr. Lyon and Gary Bennett will be leading us in this discussion.
Thank you. Good evening. So before I turn it over to Gary, I just wanted to make two comments about this evening. This budget presentation and discussion is going to be very much like the one that we give at the board meeting, but we're going to attempt at the board meeting to be a little more public facing in regards to some of the terminology that we use, and also my introduction related to the impact of these cuts. But with that said, we have held the staff meetings at every school, and the recurring kind of feedback that we've gotten, particularly at the secondary schools, the middle school and high school, is that when you see these class size averages move from what they are to what they will be based on current number projections, which is kind of one methodology unto itself. But the feedback that we get is, but wait, that's not really the way it's going to be. Because particularly at the middle and high school, you've got electives that sometimes draw down those numbers, sometimes draw up by virtue of the size of the classes for the students. And the core class impact is probably higher than the numbers that you see in many, many cases. So we have to be really understanding, particularly at the secondary level, that those class size numbers that we're going to see tonight don't really tell the story accurately of the reality of what's going to happen. For example, at the high school, there's going to be enormous core class sizes, and that really concerns us. And then the second thing that I'll say is that I really do want to take a moment to acknowledge Gary and Steve's work. They have really put it into overdrive in terms of being so meticulous about the human resources side of this and the budgetary side of this. And all of the conversations have happened. They've all gone as well as you can imagine them to go. There's been incredible care by our principals, by Steve, because Steve has really set the tone as to what these conversations have looked like. And it's in what is probably the most difficult process you can imagine. We've come through the other side in terms of the conversations very diplomatically and smoothly because of the efforts of Steve, and the numbers that you will see tonight regarding the budget side of things. Gary has just immersed himself in and really worked just forever on it every weekend, just pushing through to get to the presentation tonight. So hats off to both of you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Good evening, Board of Directors, Budget Committee. Thank you for joining us tonight. Excited to be here for our second Budget Committee orientation. Some of what you see tonight will be just an update on what you saw in the past, and we'll go into some little bit of new areas as well, and then we'll take a good look at the reductions. And for some reason we're not. Okay, we're good. Okay, so we'll take a look at a financial update for this fiscal year. We'll take an updated look at the expense forecast for next year, although it really hasn't changed markedly. It's basically the same thing. We'll combine that expense forecast with a revenue forecast and take a look at what we look like kind of with and without a levy and at different levels of the state school fund revenue that's currently being set by the legislature. We'll take a quick look at enrollments. And then, as I said, we'll get into reductions in the calendar moving forward. Just want to keep talking about this because I think it's really important that people understand our desire for increased transparency and accountability. So just a reminder that in each board packet and in multiple in-person updates at board meetings and at budget committee meetings, we'll take a really good look at some enhanced and more detailed financial reporting. One of the reasons we had some of the financial challenges we had was financial reporting that did not cover revenue and did not give the board, the budget committee, staff, and the community some of the information they needed to know the financial health of the district. Also, just a deeper engagement with the budget committee. In the past, we've never gone as deep as we did even in our last meeting, and then we're scheduling a second meeting to go a little bit deeper tonight. So really trying to bring all of you more into the fold, give you more information about what it looks like, and allow you to be able to make good decisions and ask good questions. And feel free to stop me when you have questions. We've got quite a few slides to cover tonight, so I'll keep it moving unless you reel me in, if you will. So the district financial update. One other thing you'll see is I'll try to use some formats for some slides and some things that are consistent between meetings, so you'll get used to seeing what you see on those. And I think that will help us all have a better understanding of where we are. So just to go back over this, the adopted budget is in the first column here. This was our forecast. The next column is the forecast as of September 30th. And as you can see, that was the one that caused us to all be quite concerned and know we had to make some really sharp reductions pretty immediately. By January, after the reductions took effect, you can see that it improved substantially and improved a little bit more between January and March. Now, the reason there's a 2-month gap there is the last time we met was on March 1st. So I did not have February actuals compiled at that time. Today being a little bit later in April, there's a 2-month gap because I was able to get both February and March actuals in here, which helped update the forecast to a more current date. But you can see that our ending fund balance has improved by about $30,000, the forecast from the last meeting. And our revenue has gone up largely because of increases of ODE as the state school fund has adjusted based on total ADM. It's actually up a little bit higher than that. But I tempered it down a little bit, just being conservative and a little bit concerned about the prior year adjustment. You may recall that we don't actually find out how much money we got for the 21-22 school year until May of this year, as everything gets reconciled out in terms of all the property taxes collected, how many students are in the district. So that's why that number's moved up a little bit. Hopefully it moves up a little bit more. And our expenses are due, our staff costs tricked up a little bit and other things leading us to that number. So all in all, I'd say good news, things stabilized at worst. And hopefully that's a conservative number and things improve from that point. I'm actually going to walk over here on this one, walk through a couple of things with you. So this is our financial, one of our main financial reports in the new financial reporting. And this is for the general fund. So this is where most of our funds take place. And what I'll do each time is kind of talk about a couple specific places. So this time on this slide, we're really just taking a look at the pattern of ending fund balances. So here you can see this is our forecast ending fund balance for this year, this 255,776. That's what our current forecast tells us we'll have at the end of the year. If you just look at the history of this, I think it tells you just a lot about the financial state and health of the district and the progress or lack thereof we've made. In that in 2021, we started with $4 million in the bank. We ended the year with 2.7 in the bank, which means we started last year with 2.7 in the bank and ended with 911,000. But that 911,000, you might recall, is only there because we withdrew $1.35 million from the ESD and some funds we had served over there, some reserves we had over there, and pulled them in to get to that number. And so you can see as the fund balance continues to drop, we projected an opening fund balance in our budget of 3.17, when in reality it was more like negative 400 because we pulled some funds in. We started the year with 911, and then we're going to end the year ideally with 255,776 or more. So part of this is to not only just put the financial statement out there so that everybody sees it, but to take a look at one thing you might want to look at when you're just studying kind of this pattern of financial health of the district. And stop me if there's questions, otherwise I'll keep going. Here's another look at this is the same report with just different numbers highlighted. And so in this case, there's a few things worth noting. If you start on the revenue side, you can sort of do a reasonableness test in this. And so if our 2021 beginning fund balance, our actuals rather, is 53.9 million, actual, that's what we actually had, that's an audited financial number. And in the next year, we're at 55.6. Is 57.9 a reasonable estimate? It's a question that we can all ask ourselves. And it turns out that that estimate really wasn't too bad. We're now projecting 57,529. So about 400,000 short of what was projected. If you look at the resources column, however, it tells a little bit different story. If our total 58 million here and 58 million here, what makes us think they might jump to 61 million there? Might be a question to ask. And this is where our ending fund balance just did not with what we anticipated. And we ended up with resources projected at 61 million, ending million. Is this thing fading out, or am I talk more directly into it? Point it towards me instead of down, like I'm on American Idol. Okay, perfect. Which you
Gary,
don't want.
just, I just want to put a fine point for the folks watching at home. The reason why, and we would ask these questions today for all of the obvious reasons, but this wasn't data that was in front of the board. Is that correct?
Wasn't in front of the board, wasn't in front of just staff in general, and not there for the community. And this is part of the reasons why I really believe that better financial reporting will lead us to better outcomes and keep us from ending up in a tough situation again.
Thank you.
And Gary, just one more thing to clarify, to make it really clear. It wasn't that anybody was hiding this information. It's that nobody had a report that contained this information to look at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We had the same basic financial reporting structure as long as I was in the district, as far back as I looked, and never had any problems with it. And only when we had a problem did then it become exposed, if that makes sense. It worked fine for us when things were trucking along well. So then onto the expenditure side, you can also look that total expenditures in 2021 were 55 million, 55.3, 57.9 looks like a reasonable estimate. It just didn't match up very well with our revenue number. And you can also see the impact of the reductions here. And we went up about $2 million in expenses here. From here to here, we only go up by about $800,000. And you can see the impact of the reductions we took this year and bringing that number down. So just wanted to point out a few things about that financial statement as we walk through it that might be helpful to the budget committee and the board and folks at home. Any questions about that? The next two financial statements we'll move through fairly quickly. This next one is our special revenue fund. And this contains lots of different things. This is mostly grants, is what's contained in this fund. There are also some other funds in here that we've talked about quite a bit, like the athletics fund. We talked about the deficit in that fund. We talked about nutrition services. And for the most part, these are funds that are pass-through funds, meaning that we get a $3.8 million grant from the state. We spend $3.8 million in services. They write us a check for $3.8 million, and the funds just kind of flow through us, if that makes sense. So things look fine in this fund, and I'll just kind of go quickly through it. We're projecting an ending fund balance of about 1.28, which is down from last year, but we still have almost $733,000 in contingency, which will drop to that bottom line, putting us right about where we thought we would be coming into this year. Onto the capital projects fund. This is the fund which all of the money from the bonds comes into. So this is where the money for the new high school sat, for this building sat, as we transformed all the other schools. And it was really the same fund when the ridges were built and things of that nature. And so we still have a healthy balance in there, a little over $6 million we're projecting at the end of the year. And I just want to point out, I think it's really important to point out that all of the projects in the bond came in on time, on budget, and we still have the money left in this account. A lot of the money sitting in this account is for curriculum and technology. where we told the voters in 2016 we would be able to sustain 10 years of technology and curriculum, and we still remain on track to do that. So this fund is in good shape, and we'll just kind of go quickly by it, but things look good on this front. This is the place where we have a little bit of challenge. And I talked about this last time, and the challenge has grown a little bit here. This is our debt service fund. And so this is the fund in which, when we pay back the money that we owe on the bonds, we collect property taxes, it comes into this fund, and then we pay back the bondholders. There's also a PERS bond in here as well. And I'll spend just a second on that so people know what that looks like. In 2005, the board at that time decided to essentially borrow money, take out a bond at an interest rate, give the money from that bond to PERS in hopes that the return that PERS earned on the money would be more than they paid in interest on the bond. It's turned out to be a good move. It's worked out that way for sure. That's also in here. And the way that is paid, that isn't paid through property taxes. That's paid essentially through a payroll tax we put on ourselves. Instead of paying PERS rates to PERS, we pay it into a side account, and we make that payment each May. And so we're in good shape in that account. Everything looks fine. The place where we're in a touch of a challenge, and it's not a challenge that's going to cost us any money. It's not a challenge that's going to cost taxpayers any money. It's essentially, we're going to need to take some money, if I could use a metaphor, take some money out of savings, put it into our checking account, pay the bill, and when the money comes back in, put it back into savings. Because what happened is we did not collect enough money in taxes this year to pay the entirety of our bond payment. And I'll talk about a little bit why that is on the next slide. So what we will need to do with this, and the board has already given us authority to do this at the beginning of the year, is we will borrow some funds from the construction excise tax fund. Construction excise taxes was about $1.3 million in that account. Funds come in whenever builders build a new home and pull permits. We collect part of that, and we can spend that on capital projects or debt for capital projects. We'll borrow the money from that fund for this year. When we collect our property taxes for next year, we'll collect enough property taxes to cover next year's payment and that amount and pay it back. It'll be even money for the taxpayers. It'll be even money for the district. It's not a financial problem. It's something we need to address, and we will. I want to show you on this next slide is a little bit more complex, but I think it's an important one to talk about. This is a little bit of history on our debt services fund. So let me walk you through what's on this slide, because it's not confusing, but there's a lot of numbers in a small place. So on this side over here, these first 4 columns, these are our payments on all of our bonds from 2015 through next year. So in 2015, we had an $11 million payment on our bond. In 2015, we refinanced some bonds to save our taxpayers a bunch of money, which ended up allowing us to pay off the bonds sooner. And so you see this new bond appear here in 2015, and this one drop off substantially, the payment on that, as we refinanced parts of the bond that we could save some money on. In 2017, we actually took out a new bond, which we started paying in 2018, and we sold these bonds in 2017. That's our 2017 general obligation bond. And that was the first wave of capital we raised to build the new high school and take on these construction projects. We did the same thing in 2018 and started paying on that bond in 2019. And so you can see these are the total of our payments over here each year on these bonds that we have to collect taxes and pay back. Is that pretty clear so far? On the other side, this is more the payment structure. So this is the total assessed value in Sherwood in each of the past several years. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the local option levy. This is the average, this is the assessed value growth, which is a pretty remarkable number in all honesty, given the tax laws of the state, assessed value can only grow by 3%. So any growth above 3% has to be new development. That's the only way it can take place. So we've had really strong growth. And then these are our actual bond rates. So these are what we charge the taxpayers. We don't actually decide on the rate. We decide on the amount, and then the assessor looks at the rate and decides what that rate's going to be. But we decide on the amount, and you can see these are our rates, and they've been coming down consistently since 2018. And this was the first year that the old bonds went off and we were just paying on the new set of bonds. So the good news is that for one, this tax rate dropped substantially. If you look at the trend of this bond rates, we had a substantial drop here. And this was an attempt to really try to keep the cost as low as possible, not carry a big reserve that our taxpayers are bearing the burden of, keep that cost low for taxpayers, and levy the least possible amount to pay our bills. Unfortunately, we had a couple things happen to us. If I go back to the prior slide. One, our property tax collections have been a little bit beyond what I earlier expected. The other thing is last June was the lowest, last May and June were the two lowest May and Junes in the past 5 years of property tax collections into this fund when you look at the history. And you can see that in that our beginning fund balance was projected to be 624 and it was 404. If we would have been on this beginning fund balance of 624, we would have had enough money to cover this payment. Does that make sense? So we kind of got hit twice. We had a little bit lower than property taxes than I thought we were going to have coming in. And by the way, this was levied as part of the budget for last year, and you will set this levy rate as part of the process going forward. So the tax rate was a little bit low last year, but that was an attempt to keep things affordable for homeowners. And I think the best part is this is from our 2016 ballot title. And what we put in the voters pamphlet was the estimated tax rate would be 50 cents per $1,000 of assessed value above the 2016 rates. So down here is a calculation of that. 2016 rates were 3.71, add 50 cents to that. What we told the voters is they'd be paying $4.20 per thousand. In reality, this last year they paid $3.43 per thousand, or almost 80 cents lower than what we projected. And even if you step it back up a year, you're still talking about a solid 50 cents below what we told them what they would be. So if this number goes up by a little bit to compensate so we can pay back that fund and raise sufficient capital, we're still going to be on this trend line and still going to be in a really good place. Okay, that was a lot of me talking and a lot of different numbers. Any questions or comments?
Just that we had projected that to be at 4.2 for a long time. So the fact that we're not just a little bit below it, but substantially below it, even if we toggle up and down a little bit, that's still pretty substantial savings for homeowners.
I would agree. And we were intentionally conservative in that in 2016 when those rates were set. Because you can't really project AV growth. And you can, but you don't want to be wrong.
And the other part of that is so when we made the decision to set the rate as low or to set the rate at the kind of precise low end estimate of what we thought would come in, that means it would be equally likely for us to miss a little bit on the upside or the downside.
Yes.
And so this is just kind of the mechanical result of trying to make the most precise estimate and set that number as low as we feel comfortable setting it. We're going to miss one way or the other. And this is us just missing looked like around 1%, which is within the range of what you'd expect.
But if I understood what you were saying is like that we didn't actually, and we set the rate because the budget committee has to set the rate and then the district does, but that what we went to the assessor with was, here's how much we want to raise to pay this off. And they gave us the number.
They gave us the levy rate. And then included in that calculation, you have to look at a historical average of delinquencies. So we average about 97% of our taxes actually get paid each year. And so you look at a 5-year average of that, you look at how much cushion you have in terms of the ending fund balance moving forward, and then you make not an educated guess, but you make a formulaic estimate of what it's going to be. And this one was like you said, on the low end, and it could have just as easily come in on the other side of it, but it didn't.
I think what's really tricky about this, and it's here nor there, but when we're talking about everything going on and trying to help people understand, we know a lot of people don't tune in necessarily to these meetings, right? And so even though we're giving very specific budget numbers about how this works out. The average person just sees a really nice high school and now sees that we need more money, right? And they don't understand the difference and where the money went and what we need it for. And yes, maybe so I guess I just feel like it's very important for people who do understand and people who are listening to help other people understand this piece of information. It doesn't make everybody feel better. Everybody doesn't even care if you share this with them. I mean, that's the reality. But I do think it's important to share it with people because most of us who voted to pass the bond were super happy and proud to do so. But as soon as we did it, we forgot whatever we said we would agree to pay, and so it's really easy to move on from that and have no idea what we ever thought we were going to pay. And so there is a little bit of onus on all of us to like help communicate this message again to people. And when I do, I mean, I don't try to say like you're saving, because you look at your bill and you don't feel like you're saving money when you pay your taxes. But I do try to explain to them that you are spending less on this than what you initially committed to spending. And at the very least, people are like, that's interesting. That's interesting. Okay, so maybe we are doing better with that than we initially thought we were. So I don't know. I would encourage people to share that information.
And I think the short answer here is that the projects came in on budget, on schedule, and for less money out of pocket than what we said in the ballot measure, and by a reasonable margin. 80 cents per thousand is a significant margin. Now it may not stay right there, but that's a good margin. And you're right, it's really complex, and that is sort of the nature of government finance in general, is that it's complex.
I mean, for that matter, people are paying less now than before we built the new high school and renovated all of the schools. We now have more capacity than we did in 2015. And the assessment for the bonds is less than what they were paying prior to us issuing these new bonds. That's pretty uncommon and pretty impressive.
Correct. I hadn't thought of it through that lens, but that is absolutely correct.
And the one way for people to think about what we did versus what we could have done when we set the number that went to the assessor was to take our estimate of what we think things are going to be and then, bump it up a few percentage points so that we were always missing on to the benefit of everyone. But what we instead decided to do was to take the number we expected it to be, which would have been lower than that kind of sandbag number, and go forward with that number. And when we do that, we're just equally likely to miss a little bit on one side or the other. So this is us truing up the account for, the estimates that didn't quite hit exactly the way they were going to be, because that's never going to happen.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And we may have the best June in property tax collections in history, and this may not be an issue. It's hard to say. The numbers, there is a definite pattern there, but it can be anywhere from $500,000 to $124,000 over the past 5 years in May and June. And you don't when the month closes, and they come in all the way through July and August. July and August receipts go into the prior fiscal year. So we will have long since paid this bill by the time we know how it actually plays out. Okay. Any more questions about that? That was kind of a long, detailed analysis. Checking the time here. Keep moving. Okay, I'm going to move quickly because I'm a little bit behind. So the expense forecast for fiscal year 24, this is largely the same. It was a 10% increase that I showed last month. Where the 10% comes from tweaked around a little bit, but it's still the same basic things. The salary cost increases because we have a 3% cost of living allowance. We have 1.5% experience steps. We've got about $1 million worth of folks who used to be paid for in grants, where we used up all the surplus in those grants coming back into the general fund. Then on all of those things, you have payroll costs, PERS, Social Security, health insurance, all of those things escalate. PERS rates went up by 0.4% this year, or 7.75% this year. And In addition to that, the paid family leave, Oregon paid leave is another 0.4% of payroll. So anyway, those costs bear in there. And then in the other expenses column, I actually had a transfer to athletics in that other column that anyway, we don't need to get into the details of that. The other expenses column, that is electricity costs, that is water costs. We had some deferred utilities costs from the city this year that'll come back into our budget for next year. And there's a lot of things driving that change, and just the general cost of doing business that we all feel when we go to the grocery store and get our electric bills at home. We're definitely feeling that here across the 7 buildings. And so these are, the other thing I want to point out is these are forecasted if we did nothing to change what we're doing.
Do these include the furlough days coming back?
These include the furlough days coming back too. That's another expense there.
So is that part of the 9.2 on salaries? Or
Yes.
Is that both in the salaries and benefits?
It would be both in the salaries and benefits.
Okay, thank you.
And the main reason salaries and benefits are different is because of those increased payroll costs around PERS and paid family leave. I saw a question brewing over there.
So Gary, just one quick question, and this is just part of my own understanding as well. Looking back at kind of what we presented or what you discussed last budget meeting, the numbers look a little different than what you shared in that detailed deck in that first walkthrough. It's ultimately the percentage change is about the same, but I just want to make sure I understand why there might be a small variation in what we saw last time.
That's a great question. So for one, I had 2 months more actuals in this year. And so that gave me a little bit sharper forecast in a couple of areas. And then we just learned some things about, as we got sharper and sharper in developing the budget, learned about some more costs moving around. We just made our estimate more precise and some stuff moved around. It didn't change much, did it?
No, percentage wise, you're still on point. It just, there's a couple 100,000 in accounts ultimately from what we saw last time.
Yeah, there was definitely
It's
some
negligible.
movement as we sharpened it up and learned what places we could save money and places that were going to cost us more money. That just became evident. And
Okay.
as you know, things evolve month to month, time over time, and that's where it came from, though.
Okay, thank you.
But that was the process. Thank you for asking. Just a quick reminder, these are some grants that we have. Student investment account is our biggest one. That's paid for by the corporate activities tax and funds a lot of different positions in our district. High school success was passed by the voters. That's another $1.4 million in grants. Both of those grants carried a surplus into this year. We didn't spend all the money from the prior year and carried it over. And we plugged staff into those this year to avoid more reductions, but there's no more of that capacity left in the grant, if that makes sense. So they have to come back out of the grant and into the general fund. So that's part of our expense increase. We also took about $300,000 out of the IDEA grant. There was a big capacity in that one. We put a lot of staff in that grant. They're coming back to the general fund. And then we have some, a little bit of money in Title 1A, which goes to serve schools with students and families navigating poverty, and Title 2A, which is really about instructional improvement. And so those are our major grants. We have lots of others. We have a whole spreadsheet of others, but these are the bigger grants that we have in the district.
So Gary, just to make sure that I'm understanding and to clarify for anybody who's watching, it's not necessarily that we have 10% more spending this year, or we're proposing 10% more spending in these areas as part of the budget. It's that there were some one-time steps that we took last year that lowered the number that we're comparing to, and now those one-time steps aren't going to happen again.
That is correct.
So it's a good chunk of that 10% is actually just the kind of mechanical unwinding of some of the steps we took this year to balance the budget on a one-time basis.
We have used yes. In addition to these grants, we have used the remainder of our federal funds that came in as COVID relief. We had about a $500,000 grant we used to pay for substitutes this year. That was a one-time grant from ODE. And so as all those grants go away and essentially come in the end of what we saw as a kind of a long string of COVID relief funds go away, we use those pretty aggressively this year to not have to make reductions in the middle of the school year, which can be even more difficult than what we're facing right now. So that's a good point of clarification. Thank you. So on to the revenue forecast. So last time we talked, we were sharing some good news about a really strong revenue forecast and a really positive governor's budget at $9.9 billion. And today I'm sharing with you that we're still set at $9.9 billion. Traditionally, the co-chair's budget has come out at a higher number than the governor's budget. And so it was not welcome news that we are still at $9.9 billion. We're hearing some rumblings that if the if the next revenue forecast on May 17th comes out in good shape, that we will get some additional funds in the state school fund, but we won't know that until May 17th. And in the days that follow that. So while not great news, hopefully our legislators will have some extra funds and come through for us, but this was not super welcome news.
It was shocking news, I think I mean, for those of us that have been around and doing this for a while, I have never seen a co-chair number, no matter who is in charge in the governor's office or at the legislature, where the governor's number was replicated. It has always been higher. So this is a shocking occurrence, not common. And in part, this is due to a real serious failure in how the state calculates current service level for K-12. The fact is that calculation does not take into effect actual costs. Our CSL came in like 2.5% more than we were 2 years ago versus higher education that's coming in over 8%. So there's just the calculation for current service level is a real problem. It exacerbates the problem for districts like Sherwood. And this is a failure on the state's part because that number comes in at 9.5 billion. The co-chairs believe that they're generously giving an additional 400 million above CSL to K-12 education, and that should be incredibly sufficient, when in fact the current service level number is completely insufficient, is not a true CSL number. And so when you add 400 million, you start to get to a point where, okay, that is still a cuts budget for every district in the state, especially districts that are already disadvantaged by the formula like Sherwood. If
If it goes this way this year, it will only continue to go down. There needs to be an uproar of letters to your legislators, because this is dangerous.
I agree. I'm going to keep moving. So this next slide. Okay, so these are, again, back to a couple of kind of complex slides, but I think they tell a pretty important story. So here's what we're looking at here. These are our fiscal year, last year's actual numbers. This is our estimate for this year. And this is our forecast at each of those state school fund levels between 9.9 and 10.3. So what our estimate is this year, we have total revenues of 57 million, total expenses of 58. We have actually an operating deficit of $712,000, which is why our ending fund balance will go from 911 to $255,000 this year. So that's looking at this year. So next year at $9.9 billion, the current level, our revenue only goes up by less than $700,000 while our expenses go up by $6 million. And so that proves pretty challenging. That would put us at an operating deficit that's pretty substantial. Add to that our ending fund balance. This would be our projected ending fund balance with this as a beginning fund balance, which if we wanted $1 million in reserves at the end of next year would necessitate $6.69 million in reductions. Does that sheet make basic sense? I also added a bit of context at the bottom for you in the past, and I think this might be something we might want to consider formalizing, or this would more specifically be something the board would want to formalize. But the board has in the past talked about having a reserve target between 5 and 10% of revenue. And so I put these numbers at the bottom just to put this in context. So when we're talking about a reserve of $1 million, we're not talking about being excessive by doing that. We need to set those aside and start building that back up. As of now, we have identified $6.8 million of reductions. We have had conversations with staff up to $6 million. Lots of districts are budgeting in this 10-1 range. There's indication out there that some more funds are going to come into the state school fund. There's also hopes that a literacy initiative is another $100 million, which will help us out. We're tracking this carefully. I also think ODE might be a little bit conservative in their revenue estimates. A lot of things that could happen that are making us not enact these last reductions, because we're hopeful that we will get at least to this place. We'll watch it carefully, but that's the budget we're planning on building and bringing forward. If things go well, you can see that we can recall some of these staff members and add some of the staff that have been reduced back, or the board could choose to add that to reserves, but bringing back some staff is a possibility. So you can see how much the state school fund difference, a couple $100 million makes a big difference. Part of the reason is these reductions between here and here become even more challenging than what you'll see tonight. So that's not the great news. Questions?
So Gary, real quickly on this one here, obviously with the kind of increased forecast, you've also increased the reserve target. Is there a model that would set the reserve target just at $1 million versus kind of continue to increase the reserve target with the increased?
Yeah, that's a great question. We could easily decide to do that. This was a sample model just to show what it might look like. And me being a little bit conservative, or us being a little bit conservative and just wanting to start building up those reserves, but not taking all of that benefit away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
That's
you.
certainly an open question, and we can talk about that more as the budget committee meets.
Kind of related to that question, have we done a look back on what our past draws on reserves have been? Just to kind of give us because there's a tendency to just say like, oh, 5% sounds good and 10% sounds better. But like the real reserve number that we need is the expected funds that we would need to meet a projected shortfall. And have we looked back to see what those numbers have been like in past? I mean, I'm assuming it's recessions that cause us to draw down reserves to manage.
I haven't gotten out a
Yeah.
spreadsheet and cranked it out, but having been here through the last major reduction and been pretty involved in it, we were around 10% reserves heading into the Great Recession, and we were able to fend off reductions far better than other districts in that time. And we drew those reserves down to like, I think about 4%, if I remember correctly, 4 or 5%, from like 10 to like 4 or 5% over that time. But I don't have the numbers on paper to pencil that. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I know anecdotally, but I don't have the math.
but that's a really good, that's just kind of anecdotally talking about it. Like that's a good reason to not go to 10%. If we we look back historically and, you know, knock on wood, we have another Great Recession level event, which was very, very significant. Make sure that we don't. But if that was a 5% draw on reserves over the course of that cycle, like that to my mind, that's good. That's a good argument for not considering 10% reserve targets.
And the thing that I didn't add to that was that drawdown of 5% also came with millions in reductions. And the reason we didn't draw down reserves further is we just didn't know what was coming next each year out of the legislature. And so we still had cuts almost as significant as what we're facing right now at that time. They didn't come all at once. They came over the course of 3 years, but they were a little better than 10% of our funds were reduced at that time.
The other factor that I think is worth us examining as a full kind of board and budget committee is to talk about the impact of reserves on our bond rating. Because that's a very real cost to us, and the fact that we kept those reserves between 5 and 10% reduced substantially the cost of borrowing, and we've been able to largely lock that in. But in the past, when rates dropped significantly, we were in a financial position to refinance because our bond rating was so strong because of our reserves. And so that's something for us to just consider, as well as, you know, what are the offset costs of that?
Absolutely. So the other slide is, this next slide is actually a lot more fun than this slide. This is what it looks like with the levy passing. So at 9.9, if we did exactly what we're doing right now, we would be about $190,000 short of meeting this full reserve target. But just with retirements through attrition and still having really, really attractive class sizes, we would more than be able to cover this number and operate essentially as we are right now at 9.9, and even bank a little bit of money more than likely. If things improve, we could do exactly what we're doing right now, more or less. And if it all went into reserves, that's what it would look like if that's the decision we made. So that's really, really productive. One thing to think about is the levy, the education levy, should it pass, is slightly more volatile than collection of taxes from the state because of that phenomenon known as compression, which we talked about. And so best practice around that with a levy is to actually hold a little bit more in reserves than you would otherwise, because if you get into a downturn, you could not only lose revenue from the state, but also from your levy, and you want to be prepared and hedged well against that. Yeah, Derek.
And Gary, is this model here, is this assuming the levy's at $1.50 per assessed value?
This is $1.50 per assessed
Okay.
value. And this is assuming the levy we have on the ballot passes as written. And it's a much more fun slide than the last one.
But just to make the point to people who are listening, like those numbers are not, those are very, we would still have work to do to build reserves, even with the levy passing. So it's not as though we're gonna have a huge windfall that's all of a sudden, we're not asking for much more than we need. There will still be belt tightening, and there will still be a process of rebuilding our reserves, even in a levy scenario.
Thank you for pointing that out. That is important and something I wanted to cover. I'm just mindful of time, so I'm trying to move. And I really appreciate that, because that is important. We're asking for a maintenance levy to allow us to maintain our services and build our reserves to where a healthy organization our size should have, given that financial status. And it will make a significant difference in what we can offer to kids and our stability over time, as compared to if it does not pass. So what we will do is fiscal staff will get to work preparing 2 budgets. We've already started working on it. One budget will assume there will be no levy. One budget will assume the levy passes. We'll create a separate fund for all of the funds where the levy expenses and revenue will reside. That'll make it easy to track, give good transparency to our community about how we're spending the money. It will also enable us to build a budget fairly efficiently, and that if it passes or doesn't pass, the money is sort of collected in one place. And so it will allow us to do a quick turnaround to decision on the levy, to passing a budget, to moving forward, because those have to happen in fairly rapid succession to stay with our timelines. So I'm just going to buzz through enrollment. Here's the situation on enrollment. We're using the same number we talked about before. Things have remained pretty stable, and we look pretty good in that front. Is that okay if I just keep moving and get to the other part of the slide deck? Okay, so we want to make sure we have time to talk about reductions with the budget committee. As Dr. Lyon said earlier, we will talk about this with the board tonight, and maybe take a little bit more time than we take today and kind of go a little bit deeper into the stories behind this. But we did feel it was important, not only for the record, but for the budget committee to hear what these reductions look like, sound like, and the process we went through to get there. So on that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Emmert, and he'll present the first part, and I'll jump back in for the second part.
Thank you, Gary. So my hope tonight is just to give kind of an overview, 20,000-foot view of what the process looks like when we go through a reduction in force. It seems like there are always questions about how do you decide who you're going to lay off when you have layoffs? And there's a very specific process that we have to follow contractually and legally. And so I want to go over that just real briefly. And then Gary will come back up and just get into a little bit more of the details of who is being impacted by these reductions. So I want to start out by saying, you know, we're very fortunate in this district, and we've mentioned it before, in that we have a really strong relationship with OSEA and SEA, our two unions. And so they have been at the table with us through these processes in the reductions for our classified and our licensed staff. They've attended some of our exec team sessions. They have been in our admin councils, some of our admin councils. They've given us feedback. They've asked questions. They've presented ideas. And so it's been very challenging, not because of them being at the table, just because anytime you lay off people, it impacts their lives, and it's a challenging process. Nobody enjoys it. So when we go through this process, we really have to look at through two different lenses. The first one is to build the budget and decide how much FTE we have to lay off. And you'll see the letters FTE behind numbers throughout the presentation. FTE stands for full-time equivalent. And so if you see 1.0 FTE, that means one full-time staff member. If you see 0.5 FTE, that's a half-time staff member. And we have many in between those numbers. So we first decide how many, and then that determines, and we use a whole bunch of different things to determine how many staff members we need to lay off, how many licensed, how many classified. The bulk of our money is in our licensed staff. And so that's oftentimes, like in this case, you'll see tonight, that's where the majority of our layoffs are happening. Once we get through that process, we look at the contract language and the Oregon Revised Statute. And so well, first I'll talk about our administrative reductions. So we deal with them in the same way that we deal with our licensed staff, our certified staff. They're covered by the ORS, by the law. They don't have a contract. They don't have a union. It's not a contract, it's an agreement that we have with them. But they're not protected by a contract in the same way that our licensed staff or our classified staff are. We reduced by 2 in the fall by not refilling positions. And then all of our administrators agreed to take 5 unpaid furlough days this coming school year as a cost savings measure, in addition to the 2 that we reduced earlier in the year. We then moved to our classified staff. Classified staff members, even though there is no ORS that protects them, they have contract language that gives us a criteria that we use to determine who gets laid off. So we have 9 classifications. We look within each of those 9 classifications, and we look at seniority. So we create the seniority list, pull it all together, start from the bottom up, and then start working our way through who has the least seniority. We also look at qualifications within a position. And then if necessary, we look at personnel evaluations if there's like a tie, so to speak. There is a bumping process in our classified contract. And so this is where it becomes kind of messy and time consuming. Once we have the seniority list and we determine who's going to be laid off, we have to look to see whether or not they can bump. So we lay off, first of all, positions. We may say we're going to lay off 10% of our instructional assistants at the elementary level. So we look at who has the least seniority. Then we have to look to see, okay, now can they bump somebody in another building? And so there are layers of process we go through to determine who in the end is laid off. We've had all those conversations. As Jeremy said, they've gone as well as can be expected. Not fun, but people have been, I have to say, pretty amazing to process. So Gary will talk a bit in more detail about this, so I won't spend much time on it, but feel free to ask questions. This is the list of classified employees who will be laid off this round. As you can see, there's an elementary media coordinator who's retiring. We won't refill that position. The same is true for the maintenance employee. He's retiring and we won't refill that position. The others are all true either layoffs or in the case of the last bullet, our elementary secretaries will have 8 fewer days in their calendar, their work calendar for next year. It's a little bit different for certified staff. They're covered by an ORS. Temporary employees are not covered under our contract language or the ORS, but the ORS and our contract language match. And so we look first at licensure. We have to make sure that we're not moving somebody into a position where they're teaching something they're not licensed to teach. We then look at seniority, and then we look at competence or recency. We look at the last 5 years. So if just because somebody is licensed to do something, to teach something, if they've never done it, then we say they don't have any recency, so they're not in a position to bump somebody who's been teaching, even if that person has less seniority. So we look at all of that. In all cases, when we have layoffs, people have 27 months of recall rights. So that means if the levy were to pass, or if just through attrition, people retire, they move, whatever that looks like, we begin to recall these people back into these positions. In the fall of 2023, so for this coming school year, as you can see, we'll be laying off 17 elementary teaching positions, 8 middle school teaching positions, and actually 7 of those are teaching positions. One's an instructional coach, and 7 high school teaching positions. These are not necessarily at the secondary level, 8 people or 7 people. Those are FTE equivalent. And so in some cases, they're parts of positions. I'll turn this back over to Gary. Sorry, I raced through that. If you have questions, feel free to ask. I just want to make sure we finish on time.
Thank you, Steve. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about where these reductions came from so that everyone is aware, and also talk through them a little bit. So elementary classified reductions, you can see what those look like. The reduction in force for the front office staff is actually our attendance secretaries losing 8 days, 10% additional in their discretionary budgets, which pays for things like professional development and conferences for teachers, things of that nature. And then the media coordinator and instructional assistants that Steve already talked about. On the certified side, you can see the teaching positions. At each of the schools, there are either 3 or 4 classroom teachers who will be laid off. In addition, there will be 3 shared teacher reductions in our specialists laid off. Right now, we have 4 music teachers, 4 PE teachers, and 4 STEM teachers, and we will lose 1 of each, leaving 3 of each to cover the 4 buildings. That's a loss in the services we can provide to kids. It's pretty substantial. It creates scheduling challenges for our buildings, in that the schedules are now driven by the specialist schedule. And it brings some challenges to the STEM program, which currently offers 60-minute blocks of time for kids once a week. And that may not be sustainable going forward with fewer teachers to maintain that. The average class size moving from 22.7, which it is right now, to 27.4. And that's based on current enrollment and what will be next year's staffing level, just so people are clear on the math behind that. But what Dr. Lyon was talking about earlier today is when you have average class sizes of 27.4, you're going to have some classes, particularly in the upper grades at elementary, not well into the 30s, but certainly into the 30s, and maybe up even close to the mid 30s. It's a substantial change. And it also becomes a problem when, like at Archer Glen, you'll have 2 teachers at each grade level. And so if you had 68 kids at a grade level, you'd have no choice. We couldn't hire another teacher with that. We don't have the funds in the budget, and there's just not much flexibility there. And at other schools, there's sometimes 3 teachers at each grade level. And so that were 4 teachers at each grade level, but it becomes a challenge in balancing as well. So that will be the impact at the elementary level. And Matt, I saw you had a question.
Sorry, now I'm elementary school parent mode, not accountant at a budget meeting mode. So the music, PE, and STEM teacher, so there are 4 of those teachers, because there's 4 elementary schools,
Correct.
correct? So that would be, there would no longer be a one-to-one relationship between specials teachers, that's what they get called at my house, and
Yep.
the elementary school there. And I'm assuming that means that students wouldn't necessarily have the same teacher for STEM PE.
I think
use
students
that
will have
to-
the same teacher. So right now, the teachers do move between schools because Archer Glen is so much smaller than the Ridges that their specialists have to go help the Ridges to cover their positions, right? And they all teach at multiple schools. Not maybe they don't all teach at multiple schools. Many of them teach at multiple schools right now, just to cover the sections. This just puts more pressure on that. I believe kids would have the same teacher all year, but it's possible you'd have 2 siblings that might have different teachers. Like for music, does that make sense? But I believe that kids would have the same music teacher all year long. Is that what you're asking?
And maybe from year to year, that would.
And from year to year, it would change.
That would differ, whereas right now, students become really attached to those specials teachers.
They
and that's
do.
a very important part of the elementary day.
And the teachers have a home school that they're connected to and that they provide other ways, they support in other ways. And it's a loss on a cultural level. It's a loss on an instructional level because it just spreads people more thinly. And it's a loss on a scheduling level. And frankly, we're losing some great people also. It's problematic on all those fronts.
Hey,
That's
Gary.
That's another thing just to point out for people who are listening, like we just went through a lot of legalese, but all of that boils down to the fact that we don't get to be strategic in the people that we lay off. We are contractually obligated to lay off specific people, even if the best person teaching at a school is, and I'm not saying that
I understand where
people
you're
are
coming
better
from.
than another, but like we could have to lay that person off because of their standing within the legal regime that we operate under.
That's
and we don't
correct.
have the discretion to
And-
prioritize differently.
And on the teacher level, it's actually by statute. It's also by contract, which matches the statute, but it's by statute how we do it. And yeah, we have no choice. Even if we wanted to change it, we could not.
Hey,
I think
Gary,
for me, oh, good.
sorry, could you touch on if the levy were to pass, what would be the next course of action here? Would these individuals that were impacted just recently get their jobs back, or how does that process work?
So the layoffs are not in this month's board packet. They will appear in the board packet in June. So we haven't officially laid anybody off. We've just informed them that there's a good chance they will be laid off because we wanted to be humane to them so they could go look for another job while this is the hiring season in schools. So should the levy pass, the people who are laid off would be able to go back to their position had they, assuming they had wanted to and had not chosen a job within their district.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you for asking that.
Well, and one of the arguments that I've heard is like, well, these are scare tactics and these cuts are, they sound worse than they're gonna be, and maybe we'll feel it in a year or two. We haven't laid people off necessarily, but these are cuts that will happen. We can't talk, and these are actual numbers that we're dealing with. And
If the levy does not pass, these reductions will have to be put into place in order to stay fiscally solvent. Don't mistake my words about layoffs. That was just a mechanical nature of things that it did not make sense to lay somebody off and then recall them as it does to wait until we know and then make it official in June. But if the levy does not pass, these cuts will take effect. This is not a scare tactic. This is our only path to fiscal solvency.
this is not worst case scenario. This is just the reality of what it will be.
This is what it will be.
This is the reality of what it will be, and I hope that anybody that's watching, when they look at this graph and they see 3 teachers, just because there's not names listed, those are 3 teachers. Those are 3 human beings, and then trickle that down to all of the students. And really take that in, because that's pretty devastating to look at.
I completely agree with Krista, and I just want to also say that I really hope that parents in this community realize that in addition to just having this news and having to sit with this news, that these folks are still operating at the top of their game, educating our kids day in and day out while they live with this uncertainty. And I'm sorry for getting emotional. I just think that's really rough. And I'm really grateful for the professionals we have in this district who are doing the work day in and day out, even knowing that this is a reality.
Ironically, one of them was putting out snacks for the staff meeting yesterday where we presented this, one of the teachers that will be losing their position. Brutal.
And I'll just say this while the elementary school slide is up, because I'll be maximally angry, but just to make it clear to people who maybe don't have children in these schools, like we're moving out of the category of schools that provide all of these services to parents who enroll their students, and moving down a tier in terms of the services who are provided. So if someone listening doesn't have a kid invested in the schools, eventually you're going to sell your house to somebody who wants to enroll their kids in Sherwood Public Schools. And what these reductions cause, parents like me to really think about is, do I want to have my kids in Sherwood schools when I could move to Wilsonville or Tigard or Tualatin and have a different level of service?
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, because I know I have an elementary school kid and I volunteer in her class often. And I think about class size and think, if you don't volunteer in a classroom, you might just think a couple extra little kids, right? But really, you have no idea how much they require. And so how much more time they will spend waiting and how much less time they will get to read and how much less time they'll get to hold a pencil. I mean, really, when I go in and help, that teacher is busy all the time. And I think my kid's class right now, her kindergarten class has 18 kids, and it is hard to get through all of those kids and even get them to read their book one time. And they have aides and they have lots of support, and it is still so hard. And so to think of how those kids will possibly get what they need with that many more bodies in that room, it has a massive impact on those elementary classes that those kids can't just facilitate that learning on their own.
I just had a flashback of fourth grade. Our boys were in fourth grade together before the boundary change. And we had 34 kids in a portable at Archer Glen. Now add on top the human toll of teachers and staff losing their job. It was hard enough with 34 kids in a classroom. And if your kid isn't in trouble academically or not challenged enough, your kid is in the middle and they just get lost in the mix. So now multiply that across the whole district and not just one class at one school. It's very serious. These numbers are very serious. These are people's lives, their livelihood. And it's their future. And frankly, if this levy doesn't pass, I would not move into this district because there's no guarantee that my kid will get a good education without it.
And it honestly doesn't get better as you move up the levels. Here you can see the reductions at the middle school. Losing a Spanish teacher means we will no longer offer Spanish at the middle school. You can see the impacts on the core teachers. 7 teaching positions. The average class size goes from 26.9 to 31.3, but that will mean a lot of core classes of 35, 36 middle school kids in a classroom, because you have to offer some small classes in schools as well. And as soon as you offer one class for kids who need some extra help of 15, that puts pressure on everything else in the school. And it's all middle schools run courses of that nature. And so this will be really challenging for the kids and the staff at the middle school, and will be a substantial impact on them. The other thing is, this makes our elective classes tighter as well. All of these, in both the middle school and the high school, and just the loss of a Spanish program. How does that affect kids when they feed into a high school Spanish program? They can no longer enter into high school in Spanish 2. They have to enter in Spanish 1, which affects their ultimate trajectory should they want to go mean, there are lasting impacts for kids of these kind of reductions.
At the middle school, losing 2 science teachers and having an average class size of 31.3, which means you're gonna have science classes in the 37, 38 range at the high end. Like, can you do a lab anymore? Because at that point in time, you're in crowd control.
That's a challenge at both middle and high school, is running a lab when you only have a certain number of stations. A lot of the hands-on activities will go away, because you just can't serve all the kids in the same way you can when there's 31 in there, or 28 in there, or 27. And you even run into furniture challenges. I've taught in classrooms that big before. During the .com bust, we had the similar thing, and I had a hard time. One of my biggest challenges was figuring out how to fit the desks in my classroom so that there was still a walkway so kids could get around, because you don't only have more kids, you got more furniture and more kids. Proves really, really quite challenging. And the high school, you can see the reductions there. Impacts are significant at the high school as well, where their classes are already high at the high school. And when you talk about average class sizes of 35, you're talking about core classes in the 40s for sure. Not all core classes, but many core classes in the 40s. Right now, we have furniture for 36 in our high school classrooms. And so you're talking about moving furniture to make this work. And that proves challenging. In addition, those of you with high school kids right now already know how challenging it is to forecast for some of those elective courses. It's hard to get the ones you want because they're so in demand, and you start reducing across the board, but they had to reduce across the board, and you start reducing elective teachers. That puts even more pressure on those courses. And some of those are fixed in terms of the number. And you talk about a computer graphics class, there's only so many computers in the class. You can't add kids to that class. And so that makes it even more challenging to get into those electives when you start putting that pressure on. And 34.9 is, as an average, is untenable in my mind, but that is our reality.
That's, can we just flip back there real quick?
I'm trying.
Sorry, as a,
No,
as a parent of high schoolers. Every single one of these slides is extremely devastating. When I think of, every single level has its impact that will carry on to the next level, right? We're looking at high school now, and we're looking at these kids that are a mere couple years away from entering the workforce and from being prepared to be successful in life, to create a life for themselves, to support themselves, to getting the tools that they need. This is really hard to look at. Even down to the front office receptionist. I'm in the school often as of late, and those ladies, I mean, I don't know how they do it with the ones that they've got. The drug and alcohol counselor, drug problem are rampant right now. This is very serious. And I really hope people are paying attention to this and they can get past whatever frustrations that they might have over the state funding or what happened that was completely beyond anybody's here's control. And just, can we think about the kids? Can we think about the kids and their future and what's available to them and how we can best prepare them for this life? Because it's not easy as it is. And we have to do, as adults, as the grown-ups, as the people put to task with preparing them for this life, we have to do everything we can for them. So this is devastating.
One of the conversations that we're initiating with the administrative team is if we have to implement this budget, the strategic supports that are going to be necessary for the schools in order to have a productive and successful year next year. And our commitment is that we will make next year a very productive year for our students. But what that really means is that we can't expect that it's going to look the same. And we need to strategically understand that we're not going to be doing some things that we normally would be doing because of the impact of these budget cuts. Much the same way, and I'm not implying that this is the path that we would go down, but much the same way that districts across the nation paused in the spring during the pandemic recovery, and they took those mental health days for the teachers. And I'm not suggesting we haven't talked anything about that, but we have to be nimble in understanding that next year under this adopted budget, it will not be the same experience that we are accustomed to. Everything from professional development to homework to teacher time on the job, all of it has to be looked at through the lens of how can we provide the supports for our teaching staff and our classified staff to be able to feel good about coming to work every day, and how can we make the experience the best we possibly can for our students under this kind of budget. And that's a challenge, but that is the conversation that we are pivoting to right now, because we're if this is our reality, this is our reality, and we'll answer the bell.
I have a quick question about the expanded options program. Would that program go away or would it be absorbed by other counselors?
The expanded options program, just to explain what it is for folks, and I'll go into this more in the regular session, but it's a program where students can take college level courses at PCC while they're enrolled at Sherwood High School. This doesn't mean dual credits going away. That's still intact, where kids earn literally about 6,000 credits each year our high school kids earn at Sherwood High School. This is on top of that, and it's for college courses we don't offer. So it would not go away completely, but it would largely be eliminated. Where it wouldn't be eliminated is we have kids who blow through all of our math classes by the time they're like a sophomore. And if they're going to continue in their math education, we can't offer those courses and they have to go to PCC or to PSU to take those courses. So we'll offer them in situations like that, but the more random courses we would not offer any longer.
Okay, my son took Japanese through the EOP program and it was one of his best experiences. He loved it. So to lose the ability to do things like that would be hard.
It's really hard. It's a great opportunity for kids to be able to do. And a lot of kids take advantage of that. And that's one of the things we've continued to offer when other districts have reduced it, despite our funding challenges, because we think it's important.
Gary, just one last quick question. Just looking at those reductions, oftentimes devil's in the details. Do we have any idea? Are there potential hidden expenses? And, we talk about the class sizes growing, having enough desks. Are those, I'm assuming desks just aren't moved from other classrooms into a classroom. And I don't know the cost of a desk, but are there expenses like that as if we were to make these reductions might come back and show up unexpectedly where we didn't get the benefit of this number of reductions and there's hence more coming as a result?
So
Yeah,
I don't think it's in the furniture front, although because when we lose a teacher, we also have a free classroom that we can move furniture out of. So we have the same number of kids that need to be seated each period. So we can probably work that kind of thing out. But I think there certainly are expenses that come on the backside of this. I've budgeted a little bit of extra for unemployment costs because we're going to pay unemployment on these staff folks who don't get jobs. There's also, we've talked about, what does this look like for sub days as teachers get burned out and just worn out? Are we going to see more teachers sick? And we don't know the answer to that question, but those are things we wonder about, trying to capture those. And I'm certain there will be some we don't think of with a reduction of this size, but those are the ones we've thought of.
And just to clarify really quick, this is about competitiveness. And in the past, we have been a rapidly growing city, and that allowed us to compete with surrounding districts who have local option levies to help fund some of these programs. And as that growth has leveled off, we are now unable to compete with those districts. And the ways that's going to manifest is we're going to lose our best teachers and staff or administrators to districts who can either pay more or offer an easier workday because they don't have to deal with these constraints. And we're going to be less competitive for high earning families who want to locate in a school district that offers these types of services for their kids, and that's going to come out of everybody's home equity. And so those are the choices that we're facing here. And it's not just us bemoaning or making idle threats. It's that these are actual changes that will happen if this levy doesn't pass.
Gary, I'm starting to be real concerned about a hidden cost being our inability to meet requirements under IEPs and 504s. And our ability to meet the needs of those kids who struggle with mental health or physical health or other challenges that are required to be accommodated in our school. And the loss of the classified staff, the instructional assistants at the elementary level, more time for teachers having very large class sizes and their ability to help students who have challenges, who need accommodations. It just breaks my heart. And I think that that's something that I pray we don't have to be taking this vote. This is beyond where I want to be, but I can also say, I think, I hope this community really thinks about some of our most vulnerable kids, those that struggle. And everybody knows somebody who struggles and who need help. And those supports are going to be real hard to come by for our kids. And that's, I have a moral problem with that.
And Jessica, I just want to back that up. It's not just the kids that are struggling. It's the middle of the road kids too. I mean, it is every kid. The bottom line is it's every kid. It's going to impact every kid in some way. And I could berate on this forever, but we're short on time.
Well, if we're talking lower and middle, it tends to be the upper achieving, the high end kids that need pushed and need more and have the ability to do more, that are easy to let slide because they're doing above average. So they get even less support as well. So
that's what I'm saying.
it hits every level.
For sure. And those are concerns we've talked about as we've gone through this process for sure. So district office and other staff reductions. You can see what these look like. 5 administrator furlough days, and then some more reductions on top of the ones we already talked about, some of those to those vulnerable children that you just mentioned. And then maintenance and custodial staff, reducing those as well. We've honestly struggled. We have a lot of square footage to clean in this district and keep maintained, and losing staff on that is also problematic. Other non-staff reductions. We will reduce our landscaping services and reduce our watering. So we won't do things like put down bark next year. We'll reduce the scope of our landscape contract. When it comes to like front lawns of schools and lawns that aren't used for sports, we just won't water them. We'll let them go dormant. When they go dormant, we don't have to mow them. We don't have to water them. That saves us some money. Our competitive sports fields will continue to water. They cost too much to bring back up to snuff. But our non-competitive sports fields where kids practice on and things, we'll let those stay semi-dormant until probably mid-July, and then water them and bring them back so kids aren't having football practice on rock hard fields, but we'll let them go brown in June and July. We're recommending using the remaining PERS reserve fund, which is about $71,000, selling the Broman House property, which doesn't mean we're not interested in that program or that we want to drop it all together. It means without a levy, we just cannot fund it in the way we need to. Not renewing subscriptions to various software. And then we talked at some length about opening slots for students to transfer in from other districts to increase our revenue. And the board approved those slots at their meeting in March. And the board opened 160 slots. As of Monday, we'd already received 60 applications for those 160 slots. And so that's about $600,000 in revenue. So you can see that Sherwood still remains a place in demand. That happened super quick that we got those kind of spots, and our budget assumes we would get 65 of those kids. That's what we built our whole budget on. So that is helpful because that will help us as those students come in, they actually save jobs and decrease class sizes. I want to point that out. By bringing in revenue, they allow us to hire more staff and decrease class sizes. And so that's it's not a good thing to have to do that, but it's been a productive strategy to this point. This is sort of a shocking slide. So this combines the fall 22 and fall 23 reductions, because what got lost in what I just shared with you is we already went through some pretty significant reductions this year. And so when you look at this total, 66 staff members in total reduced, over 11% of our workforce. And on top of that, all staff took 3 furlough days this year to make it stay at that level. And so really significant reductions. When you have the same amount of need in the district and 66 less bodies to do it across all different positions, it becomes a really a challenging place to be.
Gary, can you give if the levy were not to pass, what the total percentage of loss of workforce would be combined with what we've already done?
If the levy were not to pass?
Yes.
This is what it would be if the levy did
Oh,
not
this is what
pass.
Be-
Yes.
okay.
This is what it would be if it didn't
I
pass. This
didn't
would
hear
be,
you at first.
no, I'll be more clear on that next time. But yeah, this is if it does not pass, combining the ones from this year and the ones from that we already took. Okay.
And just to reiterate from our discussion before, that 12% is not evenly distributed amongst the workforce. That's like primarily the most recently hired, most recently trained, largely, or not to throw
Yeah.
shade at anybody.
It's
but
our
like
least senior folks.
most energetic, most excited to do new things and try new things. Those are the people who we have to let go as part of this process.
That's correct. So going forward, we will know much more about what this looks like in mid-May when we have both the vote on the levy and the economic and revenue forecast. 2 weeks after that economic forecast, we'll come back for the first official budget committee meeting. This is just an orientation. That will be the first meeting on May 31st. And we will discuss the budget at that time based on what we've learned between now and then. Have a couple additional budget committee meetings if we need them, and then the board slotted to adopt the budget and levy taxes at the June meeting. So thank you for your time tonight, Budget Committee. We appreciate you coming in. And sorry we went over. Christine, you were right again. And how long of a break do we need between meetings just so we can let people? Okay.
Let's take a 10-minute break.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. let's
Thank
adjourn.
you.